Thank you for joining us today as we launch our remarkable new publication, Pursuing Justice for Mass Atrocities, a handbook for victims group, authored by museum staff member Sarah McIntosh and inspired by international justice champion and Nuremberg prosecutor Ben Ferenc. We are offering simultaneous Arabic, French, Spanish, Swahili, and Uyghur interpretation during our program today, and ask that all attendees select a language channel bottom center of your screen. Please note that you must select a language if you have selected a language channel other than English. You will also find these instructions in the chat. Our interpreters will now provide these instructions for our foreign language guests. There will be a short pause as they each do that, beginning with Arabic. In French,
pour rejoindre la chaîne française, veuillez utiliser le bouton Interprétation en bas au centre de votre écran et couper le son d'origine. Merci.
In Spanish,
Para unirse al canal de español, por favor utilice el botón de interpretación en la parte inferior de la pantalla y seleccione Silenciar audio original.
in Swahili,
Kama mnapenda kuunganishwa pamoja, mnaweza kuunganishwa kwa kuangalia kwenye katikati, na kwa upande wa chini ya skrini yenu mtaona kwamba unaweza kuchagua lugha ya Kiswahili pale.
in Uyghur, Before we begin, a few housekeeping notes. We ask your forgiveness if there are technical difficulties. If you require technical assistance, we ask that you please use the chat function located at the bottom center of your screen at any time throughout the program to reach a member of the staff monitoring the call. Please use the question and answer function located at the bottom center of your screen to type in your questions at any time throughout the program to reach the moderator. They will not appear in the main screen. We will get to as many of them as possible in our allotted time. Unfortunately, we will only be able to respond to chat requests and questions in English. We want justice. That has been the unifying sentiment shared with us over the years as we have met with Yazidi, Iraqi Christians, Rohingya, Syrian, Darfuri, and countless other survivors of genocides and related crimes against humanity. They desperately seek justice, but many victims of these crimes lack an understanding of how to pursue it. That is the void this handbook intends to fill. It is a practical guide to educate victims in ways they can champion their cause in their own voice. This handbook was designed as a tool to empower survivors of genocide and related crimes against humanity in their pursuit of justice. It describes core concepts, identifies strategies that have proved useful in certain contexts, and shares examples of challenges and successes. Throughout the handbook, we have provided examples that fall within the Simon Scott Center for the Prevention of Genocide's core mandate of genocide prevention and related crimes against humanity. However, in some instances, we've also drawn on other examples that do not meet that threshold in order to illustrate principles and approaches to justice that may be useful to victims groups. We hope this will serve as a powerful and user-friendly educational resource for victims and advance goals often expressed by civil society, foundations, the US government, and Congress, for example, through legislation such as the Iraq and Syria Genocide Relief and Accountability Act of 2018 to support local groups in their desire for accountability. Most importantly, the handbook aims to provide some answers to the questions so often posed to us by survivors of genocide and related crimes against humanity today. In recent weeks, we've seen 3 cases in Germany involving Nazi perpetrators in their 90s. For those watching today, wondering if you will ever see justice for your loved ones and community. We'd like to end with the words of Ben Ferencz. Never, never, never give up. Before I introduce our first speaker, I want to quickly check with our team on whether or not we need to do a quick reintroduction in Uyghur and Arabic. Is the translation in Uyghur and Arabic working? Great. Okay. Now that we've confirmed that our colleagues and participants that are listening to the Uyghur and Arabic channels are able to listen, it is my profound honor to introduce Judge Tom Bergenthal, Holocaust survivor, former judge of the International Court of Justice, and 2015 recipient of the museum's Elie Wiesel Award. We had the privilege of speaking to Judge Bergenthal about the handbook and are delighted to share part of that conversation today.
Well, the problem of survivors is really that they don't know very much about everything, about how justice works. I had the advantage to study early on and to gradually learn what vehicles there were for obtaining justice. Most survivors haven't got that idea at all. They need to depend on different organizations who can take those steps necessary. To their contacts, for example, are critical. How do you get to an organization? And what documents do you need? With whom do you speak? None of this was ever explained properly. Then the organization sent some people and they explain things and not always all that clearly. But that's why I think it's wonderful that you're doing things that sort of provides the basics. And that's more important than sophisticated introductions to world justice.
What does justice look like when the crimes that have been perpetrated are of such immense proportions?
To me, justice means two things. One is that those who committed the violations of justice be in some ways punished for it, one way or the other. Or that there at least is a visible mechanism where those groups or institutions are punished. That's one thing. And then just getting justice for one's own suffering, one way or the other, which can mean compensation, for example. The compensation in the case, for example, of my mother consisted mainly of getting a pension after my father. Otherwise, she wouldn't have been able to live. And then and in Germany, that was very well organized because they just simply took the pension system of the German government officials and applied it to the survivors. But only if they were German Jews. All I think victims want to see is some institution with power to punish the wrongdoers, one way or the other. They also want another institution that can provide aid that they need. And sometimes it's food, sometimes it can be just housing or help with getting immigrants back to their original countries or providing them with visas. So there's a whole slew of problems that arise when you have genocide and people are just no longer in the places where they were raised, and they don't even know most of the time where they want to be. So the big problem in my day was, how do you get a visa to go to the United States? And then how do you get some solutions? The big thing always is punishment of the wrongdoers and compensation. Compensation is critical. So those are things that tend to be lost in terms of the pain that hits survivors when they're already free. The transition, it's not just only food and some sort of income, but the environment. And that's often lost. And then, of course, there is no more environment. There are people whose countries no longer exist. Something that is really interesting about when the Nuremberg trial started and were continuing, survivors were hanging on the radio because they were broadcast on the radio in Germany, for example. So people were listening in. Who was it that was who was being interrogated? And all of those things, which meant, people spent hours listening to these things. It gave them some sort of a form of justice. There's a lot of different things that come in on somebody who is a survivor from a genocide. The problems that they face, it's not just one aspect of justice. It's, for example, trying to find relatives that you don't a livelihood. You don't know what happened to the documents that show that you owned a house. So there's a lot. And Jewish organizations had the great advantage. We were much better organized than many other nationalities. We got justice, and we should fight for other people's justice.
Thank you to those incredibly powerful words from Judge Bergenthal. Judge Bergenthal was a child survivor of Auschwitz and has dedicated his life to pursuing international justice and human rights. It is my honor to introduce Ambassador Clint Williamson, the former US Ambassador at Large for War Crimes Issues. He's currently the Senior Director of the McCain Institute. After Ambassador Williamson's remarks, my colleague Sarah McIntosh, who authored this first of its kind handbook, which compiles the advice of over 90 experts and practitioners, will be monitoring the conversation with our esteemed panel of guests. This will be an engaging conversation, and I would like to thank all of you again for joining us today.
Good morning. Thank you, Naomi, for the introduction. It's an honor to be here today and to have this opportunity to speak with you about the culmination of this incredibly important undertaking, released by the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum of the Handbook for Victim Groups on Pursuing Justice for Mass Atrocities. This guide will be a valuable resource for victim groups, and in fact for everyone who works in the field of atrocity prevention and response, and for those who advocate for accountability. My own work in this area goes back almost 3 decades, not quite as long as Ben Ferencz, but to the very beginnings of the rebirth of international criminal justice, almost 50 years after Ben served at Nuremberg. In late May 1994, I was seconded by the US government to work as a prosecutor at the newly established International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia. A couple of months after my arrival at the ICTY, I found myself sitting in old communist-era hotel rooms along the Croatian coast, speaking with people who had been forcibly displaced from the eastern Slavonia region of Croatia, some of the first victims of what was euphemistically labeled in the Balkan Wars as ethnic cleansing. They had been brutally forced from their homes, had lost all their possessions and their livelihoods. They had seen their children's educations abruptly ended, their places of worship destroyed. Many of them had been physically assaulted, and in too many cases, they had suffered the ultimate pain of seeing loved ones taken away to be killed or even murdered in front of them. In the 27 years since then, I have spoken to hundreds of people with similar stories. Whether the wounds are fresh, as when I've spoken with those displaced from conflicts in Syria or in Iraq, or decades old, like victims from the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, the heartbreak is the same. The pain that these people have suffered is beyond comprehension for those of us who have not experienced it firsthand. So no matter how many times I've heard victims and survivors tell their stories, I'm keenly aware that I can never really understand what they've been through, nor how hard it is for them to try to right the wrongs that have been done to them. It's easy to underestimate how much courage it takes for someone in these situations to give their testimony, to speak with a stranger, often from a faraway land, to relive an experience that, more than anything, they wish to forget, to talk about the moments when a family member was taken away never to be seen again, or to reveal the excruciating details of a sexual assault. Yet invariably, they show incredible bravery and offer their accounts. They do it to honor their loved ones, to fight for their communities, to preserve a culture or way of life that others want to violently take away from them. And they do it for their children's futures. Underlying all of these motivations, though, is a quest for justice. That's why this handbook is so important. It provides very practical advice to victim groups on how to advocate for themselves, how to inform the outside world of what is happening, to mobilize political and diplomatic actors, to document what has happened and preserve evidence of crimes, and how to pursue accountability for those who are culpable. It brings together in one place a comprehensive roadmap for responding to mass atrocities and for starting down a path toward justice. In so doing, it's an incredible resource, not only for those directly impacted by mass atrocities, but by civil society groups and even governments. In short, by everyone in the global community who cares about these issues. So in closing, I want to commend Sarah McIntosh for the tremendous job she did in bringing this together, assisted by Megan O'Mahony and many others, working through the museum's Ferencz International Justice Initiative at the Simon Schultz Center for the Prevention of Genocide. This is a very real example of how Ben continues to make an impact in his 101st year, and how the museum continues not only to document the past, but to strive for a better future. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Williamson, Judge Bergenthal, and Naomi. And thank you to everyone who is watching this from all around the world. I apologize for the car alarm in the background if you can hear it, and let's hope that it turns off in a minute. There we go. In a few minutes, we're going to hear from some extraordinary justice champions who have fought on behalf of their communities that have experienced genocide and related crimes against humanity. But first, I want to spend a few moments talking about the handbook which we are launching today, an educational resource for victim groups who want to take an active role in the fight for justice. I believe you should see a link to the handbook in the chat soon. Judge Bergenthal summed up the motivation for this resource really well. The international community does not always make it easy for victims and survivors to access justice. This was certainly true in the aftermath of the Holocaust, when Nazi Germany systematically persecuted and murdered 6 million Jews, an event which Judge Bergenthal himself survived. Our museum was established to memorialize this dark moment in history, in part by working to ensure that the past is not repeated, and by doing for today's victims that which was not done for the Jews of Europe. There have been many advances in the field of international justice since the Holocaust. Yet it remains a system that is often alienating and sometimes traumatizing to victims and survivors. And we think there is something wrong with that system, a system which should not only serve victims and survivors, but which should also be shaped by their needs and perspectives. And for that to happen, they need to take an active role in the process. The museum has published this handbook to help victim groups to engage with the system as it currently operates, despite all its flaws, and to point out the key tools that they can use to advance justice. We're now going to hear from some advocates who have used this system and tools to fight for justice and recognition for their communities. Jame Kolok, Pari Ibrahim, Weiwei Nu, and Roshan Abbas. But before we get to our first panelist, I wanted to remind you to please submit questions in the Q&A. Jame Kolok. Jame Kolok is a South Sudanese activist, researcher, and executive director of the Foundation for Democracy and Accountable Governance. Welcome, Jame.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure.
Jame, I wanted to start with a question that I also posed to Judge Bergenthal, which is to ask, what does justice mean to you when crimes against humanity have occurred, and in particular, when people of specific groups have been targeted and persecuted?
Yeah, thank you very much, everyone who is here, and it's a great honor to be selected to speak from a country that has undergone tremendous suffering right from the time of its independence. This book that we are talking about today responds to a lot of questions that activists have been asking, and particularly also victims of human rights violations, in terms of what kind of resource exists available to help them shape discussion about pursuing justice for the atrocities that have been committed in this country. It is a great opportunity that we have a resource that now can be able to help South Sudanese human rights activists and can be able to help thousands and thousands of victims that are pursuing justice in South Sudan. I would like to thank Sarah for giving me this opportunity. Obviously, in terms of your question, the history of South Sudan, especially after becoming independence, has been a history of violence. And this violence emanated right before South Sudan could even become independent. I would like everybody to know that this country has been fighting before 2005 for about 21 years. And shortly after becoming independent, it went again to violence in 2013. Now, all this number of years, which are almost hitting to the rate of 30, there has been completely no effort to put in place mechanisms that could be able to respond to issues of justice. And therefore, the absence of issues of justice and accountability has in one way or the other exacerbated the current violence. It has exacerbated impunity to an extent that those that are perpetrating human rights violations do not bother at all, because there is no reference in terms of accountability for those atrocities. Now, in terms of that question, the need to pursue justice, not only for the victims that have experienced before South Sudan became independent, but also for those from 2013, is important in the sense that it would be a great opportunity for them to get the response of why those atrocities have happened to them. Number two, we hope that this time the pursuit of justice should be able to give opportunity, for example, for redress in terms of compensating various victims that have suffered in the hands of those consistent perpetrators of human rights violation. In South Sudan, despite all these kind of atrocities that have been committed, the narrative has always been that South Sudanese are resilient, and therefore, even if violations are happening against them, they can forget those violations and they can pursue non-judicial processes. And yet, the non-judicial processes that have been said are hugely politicized in a manner that do not even allow citizens to be able to speak freely on the issues and ask the questions of why certain things has happened to them. Now, I believe that justice means that we are reversing that persistent narrative of the would-be perpetrators and move towards genuine application of justice that is able to punish perpetrators and able to give citizens the opportunity to be able to move on and end this mayhem once and for all.
Thank you, Jame, for those incredibly moving words. And I think you've painted a really vivid picture of some of the many challenges that South Sudanese face, like many victim communities around the world, in advocating for justice. And we only have a few minutes left before we'll speak to our next panelist. But I wanted to ask Jame about the role that you see for victim groups in pursuing justice. I know that you've worked with victim communities for many years, and I'd love to hear your reflections on what they can do, what role they can play.
Yeah, thank you very much. First of all, this handbook is coming at the time when South Sudan is in the path towards establishing transitional justice mechanisms that are embedded in the peace agreement. And therefore, our belief as activists is that the definition of what transitional justice means should be seen not only from the perspective of those that have been part of this game of committing atrocities, but most importantly, from the side of the victims. So we believe that one of the role of the victims is to be able to contribute towards ensuring that they shape the kind of transitional justice mechanisms that they want to see in this country. We have also closely these days worked to bring victims together, because one of the narrative and propaganda that has always been advanced is that why are you, for example, the activists that may not have been directly victims speaking on behalf of the victims? Where are the victims? So right now we are in the process of galvanizing victim voices by creating victims groups. And therefore we believe that it is high time that the victims contribute even to shaping debates on issues of, for example, reparations. We are at a time when victims becomes even important in contributing towards building of case files, because regardless of the situation, which look to be quite narrow in terms of justice, South Sudanese victims are optimistic that one day justice will be served, and therefore they need to contribute towards making sure that their voices are seen in the process of that justice. The last point is that we always ask ourselves, first of all, whose justice? That is the most important question that we need to ask, whose justice? And therefore, if we understand and agree that we pursue the justice to be able to respond to the demand of victims, then we must be able to endeavor and ensure that we have victim-centered programs that are able to speak to victims' needs by victim needs and be able to confirm to those doubting Thomases that it is not going to be business as usual, but victims would want to see atrocities and those that have committed them actually taken into account.
Jame, thank you. That's incredibly powerful and quite a beautiful segue to our next panelist, Pari Ibrahim, who is Executive Director of the Free Yazidi Foundation. And it's such a pleasure to have you here today. Thank you, Pari.
Thank you, Sarah.
I wanted to start with a question, if I may, that builds off what Jame was speaking about, which is, what does a victim-centered approach actually mean when we're talking about justice for genocide, as the Yazidi community has experienced, and when there are so many pressures from the international community and indeed from within the community on survivors? I'd love to hear your thoughts about that.
Well, for everyone, it's a bit different. To me, a victim-centered approach is that it means that the survivor is the one who determines the plan, the agenda, what to do, what not to do. This also has an enormous gender component. So in one case, for example, we were invited to bring survivors to Geneva for an event. I spoke with the survivors and they really didn't want to go. I got the message and we declined the invitation. I think that is a victim-centered approach. There is the general idea in many communities that the survivors must be active in spreading the word about what happened. And I think we all agree to that this is true. But who decides when, who decides where, how, who? And there's no good answer to that. In my opinion, it is important that those decisions are really driven by the will of the survivor and not only by people who are working with them or arranging things for them or translating for them. Because there's always a danger that by accident or intentionally that the process can be one that is less driven by the survivor and more driven by others. And I think every community post-genocide after atrocities can be caught in a very difficult balance between advocacy, getting the word out on one hand, and taking advantage or forgetting the needs and the will of the survivor on the other. And that is a very careful balance to make. I might have been very cautious, maybe too cautious in this regard, because any sign of discomfort or doubt from the survivor leads us to take a step back. And on the other hand, some are so caught up in the attention and the media process that the actual welfare of the survivor is lost. In the best cases, the survivors and the people around them develop mutual trust, and together they come up with their programs and activities so that the whole community can benefit, but also that each individual is treated with respect and is empowered through the whole process.
Wonderful remarks, and Pari, I think that you speak so eloquently to the fact that really these approaches differ from person to person, and the notion that there might be a one-size-fits-all approach to pursuing justice is perhaps not so relevant. And I think that's one of the things that the handbook talks about. And it says that there are many, many strategies, many areas that victims can focus on that don't necessarily involve media and public outreach, that might involve more private channels. And that's what we've hoped to achieve with this handbook. But on that note, relatedly, I wondered, Pari, whether you could speak for a few moments to the fact that, and you touched on this before, that victims within a community do have differing perspectives on what justice means. And I wondered whether, in your perspective, this presents challenges, but also perhaps whether it presents any opportunities for how we define justice, and perhaps it's both. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I think so. From our community in Iraq, our sense of justice has been formed around the Iraqi experience. So justice is very much eye for an eye mentality in our community. And I have heard this myself from many of the survivors. On the other hand, some survivors have largely given up on the prospect that there will be real justice, because a significant number of ISIS members were killed in the war through airstrikes and ground battle. So many of them are dead. And those who survived do not really seem to very often face justice in a meaningful way. Some people now talk about transitional justice, reconciliation. There's not immense variety in perspective about justice in our community, but there is variety in terms of what people can accept, when people can move on, and what is worth pursuing. Some survivors focus mostly on rebuilding their lives and leaving the past behind. Some are hyper-focused on advocacy and pursuit of justice, but there is simply no obvious way to advance justice beyond waiting for slow, painstaking investigations to proceed. In my opinion, the idea that those people who rape, abuse Yazidi women and girls, young girls, can remain free and unpunished is a thorn in the side of our community. The real truth is that without justice for those crimes, there will just be more violence and more tension between Yazidis and neighboring communities.
Pari, what you speak to there is the persistence and relentlessness that it requires to advance justice. Not only fighting factors within a community, but also the external forces. And I wondered, Pari, you've been working on this for many years, and you're a fierce advocate for justice for your community. And I wondered what inspires you, what gives you courage to keep going despite all of the setbacks and difficulties.
Well, I think that around the world we've seen already many things regarding genocide prevention. I just want to mention like what happened in the Holocaust, how the advocacy from the Jewish community led to eventual persecution of the perpetrators. I think this is something that is very good for our own community. One thing we've seen is that there's a lot of pressure from the outside community and from our community itself. And one thing that keeps me going is to ensure that the survivors have a chance to be able to tell their story, to have their day in court. I think it's really, really important that we don't forget that. It is the survivors that need their day in court so that they can explain to the world of what happened. genocide is the crimes of crimes. So we should treat it as the crimes of crimes. We should make sure that there is justice at the end of the road, even though fair justice is taking a long time, maybe 10 years, 20 years. We've seen with the Jewish community, like many years, but some form of justice is very important for the surviving community. If we want to rebuild and start a new life, this is really important.
Pari, I feel like I could talk to you for hours about this, and I'm so grateful for your really insightful remarks, and I think they'll be such an inspiration to so many people who are watching this discussion today. I'm going to move now to our next panelist, Weiwei Nu, who is a Rohingya activist, Executive Director of Women's Peace Network, and a former Simon Scott Center Fellow. Welcome, Pari. Weiwei, I beg your pardon. Thanks so much for joining us, Weiwei. As some people may be aware, there have been some extraordinary advances in the quest for justice for genocide perpetrated against the Rohingya. And I'm wondering if you could speak a bit to the role that victim groups and members of the Rohingya community have played in pressing on decision makers to take steps to advance justice.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you for having me and inviting me it's an honor to join these important discussions, and congratulations for the book. I think it will be really very, I guess, crucial or very effective, helpful tool for the victims groups if we are able to disseminate widely. So I salute your work. Thank you. So going back to the questions of how the victim or the Rohingya has played in this the quest for justice. I guess first thing that I would like to highlight here is, yes, we have made, it seems like we've made really quite a progress over the past, a couple of years, but it doesn't feel any progress for the victims. It hasn't improved anything, the situations on the ground. They remain there has been no improvement at all. They continue to suffer, whether in refugee camps or in Myanmar or elsewhere in diaspora. The sufferings are ongoing, the crimes are ongoing. So I must say that, and as we all also know, these processes are extremely slow and can be ineffective. Although we may see there are some major improvement in different places. Second point that I'd like to bring up here is that the justice system that is available for the victims of genocide, so crimes against humanity or war crimes, are extremely top down, are extremely hard to access for the victims groups. It's not victim friendly, or it's not victim it's not victims friendly at all. So it is extremely hard for the victims group to be able to access. For instance, in the case of Rohingya, whether the case at the International Court of Justice, or whether the investigations by the, let's say, International Criminal Court, the victims group, the Rohingya, does not have any agency or control over the processes. Basically, I feel like the current justice mechanisms and systems that are available for this gross international crimes are not empowering victims, rather further victimizing, or I guess the disempowering the victims by making them feel like you have to approach someone, you have to beg to someone to get justice done, to to bring justice for your community and for your people and for yourself. And that feeling is, I think, extremely disturbing and further victimizing the victim. I think this is a major issue that we need to be discussing in the international criminal justice field. When we talk about victim, victim participation or role. Saying so, when it's, I think the Rohingya people, many of us, people like us, I think, use every opportunity and every available resources, and nothing has been provided to us, but we try to find everything out of survival and use every opportunities and every available, I guess, space to talk about our rights and our, our future. And I think our people did not shy away to express their need and their to seek for their dignity and justice. I think that has been, again, for me, very to see that it has been really empowering. I'm hopeful, although we may feel like we've been farther and farther victimized, but we don't give up. That resilience, I think, which is what drives us to continue. At the same time, it's also been inspiring to see how how our people has played in a very decentralized way, whether whether they are old or young, men or women, they play a role, whether inside Myanmar or outside, or in refugee camps or diaspora. Everybody has played a role, and that has been, I think, extraordinary. And what important is, as you guys discussed earlier, to be consistent, to be persistent, and to have the spirit and try to do your part as much as you can.
Thank you, Pari. You touched a few minutes ago about the troubling situation of needing to really press for justice. I hope I'm not being too forward in saying almost to beg decision makers to do something. And I'm wondering, we need to cut to our final panelist in just a moment, but I'm wondering if you could perhaps give some advice to victim group members based on your years of experience engaging with political and diplomatic actors to press for justice. It might be quite a daunting and overwhelming experience at first, and I wondered if you had one or two words of advice for those people.
So I think it's a really big question. It's when we talk about justice, it's very, very it's beyond criminal justice system. Sometimes criminal justice. Sometimes it can be about your it can be about mental health. It can be about citizenship, or it can be about immediate dignity that you need, the shelter, the food, everything, right? It is very, very broad. My advice would be, identifying what you want and what you need, and then identifying the decision maker and policy maker, as well as identifying the leverages and talking to the right people. We know that we have so much, when we become victims of genocide, the need is so much because we are stripped away everything. We feel like we're being naked, right? So we need a lot, but sometimes it is also important that, you know, which decision maker has what authority and what mandate to provide us, and to be able to identify them is the most crucial, and asking the right, I guess, putting the right pressure to the right people is key with, you know, regardless of where you are. There are always policymakers around us, right? So it is important that to know who can provide what, and then, you know, present through that.
We're gonna move finally to our final panelist. But before we do, I just want to briefly apologize. I've been so engrossed in the conversation and so fascinated by what everyone is saying that I seem to be repeatedly calling panelists by the wrong name. And I just want to apologize. I'm just so fascinated by what you're saying and so engrossed. So thank you, Wei Wei. I really appreciate your words. But we'll pass now to Roshan Abbas, who is a Uyghur activist and executive director of the Campaign for Uyghur. Roshan, I wanted to ask, at a moment where there is beginning to be some recognition of what has occurred in Xinjiang against your community, I'm wondering, despite these small incremental steps forward, the quest for justice just seems so impossible. And I'm wondering what strategies victim groups can use to push for justice when the quest is just such a monumental battle.
Thank you, Sarah, and the Simon Scott Center for the Prevention of Genocide for the launch of this important book. You know, as you said, it is really frustrating. Many people, you know, especially this situation, many people find it hard to believe that history is repeating. We are seeing the largest mass incarceration of an ethnic group in the modern world today since the Holocaust, which led to this genocide. And the international community has sworn never again, but time after time, we have failed to learn. And the newest incarnation of the evil that has arisen with the Chinese Communist Party today threatens the entire globe. So to combat a widespread culture of denial, I think there are, you know, two ways that we could create a culture of believability surrounding the ongoing genocide. One is by creating a culture of believing the survivors. We can encourage people to listen to their personal stories, and we should trust the testimonies of the survivors over the media narratives that are pushed out by the Chinese Communist Party. Mm-hmm. And also you can look up those people online by Googling them or going to our websites to read more information. And two, by combating the idea that the Chinese Communist Party can continue to do business as usual, and that they will allow the Olympics to continue to be hosted by Beijing in 2022. Mm-hmm. They want to show off to the world the prestige of the Chinese Communist Party, and simultaneously they are engaging genocide against an entire population. So we need to stand up and say we won't allow them to pretend like everything is normal when there's active genocide is happening.
Thank you. And I think there, Roshan, you touched on another point that I wanted to discuss with you, which is when the security situation is just so difficult, when the forces against trying to pursue for justice is just so difficult to raise the profile and elevate the situation of your people. And I know that you personally had experience with this, and I'm wondering if you could speak to the strategies that you've tried to adopt to overcome some of these risks, and would love to hear from you about that.
Yeah, we have to weigh the consequences beyond ourselves. You know, I believe the conversation about the moral obligation must be highlighted for this reason. How will our community be affected if I choose to prioritize myself above the community in the sense of avoiding short-time consequences of risk, the long-term outcome will affect all of us. So my own sister, Dr. Roshan Abbas, was abducted by the Chinese regime because of my choice to speak out publicly about the Chinese regime's crimes and this genocidal actions. My activism here in America caused my innocent sister's freedom back home. So this is personal in such a heavy burden to carry, but I have to remind myself that I must put the responsibility for that on the perpetrator, not on myself. Of course, we have to decide to be as wise as we can and minimize unnecessary risk for all of us.
Thank you, Roshan. Extremely powerful words, and I'd like to thank all of the panelists for everything that you shared today. It's been such a pleasure speaking to you. We're going to move to the Q&A portion of our discussion. I'm aware that we have 7 minutes remaining, and I'm seeing lots and lots of questions flooding in. People are just so inspired and intrigued by what our panelists have shared today, and I'm afraid we won't have the chance to get to all of them. I did want to ask one question, and perhaps, Jame, you might be well placed to answer this, which is, how can we pursue justice in situations where the perpetrators are still in positions of power?
Thank you very much. I think we are working in an environment that is quite narrow, that we had to develop strategies that could adapt to this environment. And I think one of the ways that we have adopted is to bring victims to speak as one voice, other than just speaking as individuals in their various locations. So the only way through which victims or activists can insulate themselves is to speak as groups. I think that is one of the ways that we have adopted in order to protect ourselves from those that are totally against what we do. We also have to acknowledge that within the same circumstances, there are certain individuals, not everybody, for example, within the system, is really against justice. And therefore, understanding what type of allies you have within this difficult environment is itself very, very important in working in such environment. So one way is to ensure that we have got individuals that are able to provide us with adequate information so that we're able to respond to some of the situations that we are actually facing. Now, we have also worked towards ensuring that instead of individuals that may not necessarily be directly victims, the strength of the voices of the victims actually goes beyond to break this narrative and thinking of those who believe that South Sudanese are just speaking when actually in the actual sense, the victims themselves are not there. So putting victims in the front of advancing their issues, sharing their stories, asking questions is itself enough to tempt the violent nature of this individual that would always want to follow activists. So these are some of the ways that we use in South Sudan, but I have to acknowledge that it's not an easy situation, but also we have to thank, for example, our friends like in the region. We work closely with the international human rights organizations who are out there sometimes to speak on our behalf in an event that we see that things are not moving well. Our friends in the region and internationally have always spoken on issues of human rights in South Sudan.
extremely powerful, Jame, and I know you've been working so hard. It's really an uphill battle, and so thank you for sharing. I'm wondering, Pari, there's a question that I'm seeing here that I think you might be able to answer, and I'm just noting the time, and I think we'll potentially only have time for 2 more questions. And so, Roshan and Weiwei, if we don't get to you, I'm so sorry. We're just trying to keep on time and let everyone go at the top of the hour. But Pari, I wanted to ask how the COVID-19 pandemic has affected the work of victim groups pursuing justice, and whether there are ways that victim groups can overcome some of these challenges. As I said, I know this is something that has affected your work and that you've grappled with, as I'm sure all of the panelists have. But Pari, I wanted to direct this question to you.
Yeah, I mean, like, we do a lot of work with the Yazidi survivors in Iraq. One thing that's been difficult is traveling to the region, especially for international psychologists, lawyers who work on our justice project. But I must say that for the Free Yazidi Foundation, our justice team has done amazing. If we see what they are producing and what we are giving to IIIM and UNITAD, and what we're going to give to other prosecutors around the world, I'm really proud of all of them for working very hard, even during COVID. One thing has been very difficult and remains difficult is to seek funding for civil society organizations. That is one of the things that during COVID-19 has been more difficult, I think, for everyone. A key thing here is to ensure that civil society organizations do remain and do exist. It is very, very important for communities who are already from rural areas, now in this case, Yazidis in Iraq, who have lost everything in their life, who are promised a lot of things like reparations or many, many things that are promised to these survivors that we know are just not true or will never become true. And this is a real danger that we've seen also during COVID-19, because people are so vulnerable. They're in such a vulnerable situation, living for over 6.5 years in internally displaced people camps in Iraq, have nowhere to go. During COVID-19, no jobs, no employment. So people don't have money to take care of themselves and their families. For the problem here lies that, like, if you want to get justice, a lot of the time there's pressure from the outside community and from the internal community. One thing we've seen is that now with COVID-19, people are being promised certain things, and you do not want to have survivors say, I want to go for justice because they think that they'll get something out of it, when maybe some of them will never get something out of it. Maybe the perpetrator in this case is already dead in Syria or in Iraq. So we have to be very, very careful.
Thank you, Pari. Such a thoughtful response, and as all of the responses from all of our panelists have been. As I said, we only have time for one more question, and I see that it's actually directed at me, which is a pretty simple question about the handbook and what languages it's available in. At the moment, it's only available in English, but translating it into other languages, including the languages that we are featuring in this panel, is a priority for us. And we're still looking into how that will work, but we're certainly hoping to do that so that it's accessible to as many people as possible. We'd also like to translate it into Kurmanji and into Burmese, and potentially develop some other resources that don't necessarily involve reading a 200-page book, which is what we've produced. I'm also hearing how can I access the report, the link, or the book rather. The link is in the chat, and you can also access it online. You'll see online and hopefully on our social media channels later today the handbook. So I guess we might we might, one other, sorry, I'm just seeing my colleagues are sending one other urgent question, and so I'll quickly tackle it, which is about our plans going forward and how to get this into the hands of victims and survivors. And I think before the COVID-19 pandemic, we had hoped that we would be able to travel around and meet with people in person and sit down and talk through the handbook with them. And I think COVID-19 has thrown a bit of a spanner in the works. But we are going to be looking into ways with partnering with organizations who work closely with victim groups to incorporate this resource into their work. And as I said, to find ways to make it something that is really a living and an accessible document for victim groups to use. And so with that, I would like to again thank Roshan Abbas, Jame Kolok, Pari Ibrahim, Ambassador Williamson, Judge Bergenthal, and Naomi, and to the enormous team of colleagues that I have who have helped to make this event possible, and to everyone who is watching from around the world. Thank you so much. We're incredibly excited, and I hope that you all have a lovely day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.